Welcome to part 6 of the RLD Basics tutorials. In this tutorial, we're going to be looking over creating and editing graphs. If you're interested in how we got here, go check out parts 1 through 5 on our website and YouTube channel. Alright, so in this video, we're going to be focusing on graphs. You can find it inside a project summary under the viewing panel. Go ahead and click that edit button right next to graphs in order to get started, or go to the left side nav under graphs, click manage. Alright, so we have no graph so far, so we shouldn't see any show up on the screen. Let's go ahead and click to add a new graph. We get a default name, a default description, and there's no graph chosen yet. So let's go ahead and click on this to get started editing that graph. Now you'll notice that the first thing that's going to pop up when this happens is a menu that will ask us what kind of graph we want to make. So in this case, I'm going to be doing a simple bar graph, and I'll only be going over 2 graph types in this video, but in the future, we'll be putting out a whole lot more covering all the details on all of these graphs. All right, so click on the bar graph and go ahead and click OK. Now you'll notice it's a lot like the tables that we just checked out in part 5. So it asks us to drag fields into the center area where we're going to see the graph actually show up. So let's go ahead and take a look at the fields on the left side. You'll notice that here are all the fields we made in part 2 with our input form. And then here are all the fields that we made in part 4 with our calculations. Then on the right side, we'll see that there's a whole bunch of options, just like there was with tables. And we'll get to those as we go through creating this graph. Let's start by go ahead and putting in a name. We'll call this our time bar chart. Very cool. And let's go ahead and drag in some fields. So I know that on my x-axis, I want to show activities. So I'm going to show everything on here by activities. And on my y-axis, I actually want to show the amount of time spent on each activity. So I'm going to drag time over into here. And boom, immediately you have a graph in front of you with all the default styling. Now, obviously this isn't perfect. So let's go ahead and let's edit this graph to make it look how we want it to look. So let me close the graph settings and immediately go to axis settings. Now you'll notice the words are kind of going over each other here because we have spent time with friends is one of the options on our input form. So let's go ahead and put these words at an angle so they fit a little bit better on this graph. I'll go ahead and take the angle and I'll just up it until it looks just about right. Yeah, around 40 is probably good. And let me change the center so that way this first one here matches up with the first column. You can play around with this in your free time, but I'm just going to go ahead and change this as I see fit right now. My Y center, and there we go. So now I know wherever the word starts, that's the column that it's associated with, and it doesn't take up too much space. All right, awesome. Now I'm going to go ahead and close my axis settings. I'm going to go to column styles. Obviously, there's a whole lot of stuff I can do here, like I can change the bar colors if I would like. I can also mess with the lines that are around each one of the bars, or even round them out if I'm interested. I can also change the size of the bars as well. I could go ahead and put this to a horizontal orientation if I was really interested and adjust my settings accordingly, but for now, we're going to leave it in vertical. You might see at the bottom here we have stack type. We'll get to that in just a minute. Before we get to that, let's go ahead, skip over data aggregation and go to legend. Now, obviously, we want people to know what they're looking at, especially if we have multiple y-axes. So I could put a legend at the top, bottom, left, or even the right if I wanted to. For now, we're going to leave it at the top. Then finally, we'll go to graph sorting, and you'll notice we can sort on any of the fields that are put into our graph by ascending or descending. For now, we're going to do ascending by time. So we'll see that work is generally the most, and then towards the end, reading is the least. Now, going back to this data aggregation. If you're more interested in it than what I'm going to cover in this video, go ahead and click on this eye and scroll through this display. For now, I'm just going to show you what each one of these options does. So for now, there is no data aggregation. It's just showing me each time for each activity that I put into the form. Well, if I go ahead and click first record only, it'll show me the first time each activity shows up. So in this case, I see reading multiple times and work 3 times. If I click first record only, I should only see each one of them once. Boom, there you go. And you'll notice it's still sorted by time. If I go ahead and click total, it'll add up all of the things that I put inside of my input form for each activity and show them to me here. And if I go ahead and click average, we'll start to get some decimal points showing the average amount of time that I spend on each activity. So I mentioned earlier about having multiple things on the y-axis being why we might want this legend at the top. Well, let's go ahead and add a couple more things to this y-axis. Let's go ahead and, just like we did with the tables, grab minutes of time spent. Now you'll notice immediately it is much larger than our time spent. In fact, it should be about 60 times larger because 60 minutes in an hour. And you'll notice it's a different color and it's clustered next to each time that it's supposed to be with. So if I go ahead and go back to my column styles, like I said earlier, let's finally focus on that stack type. So for right now, it's clustered. They're right next to each other. If I wanted these to be on top of each other to show parts of a whole, I could go ahead and click stacked. And now when I hover over, I'll see the two tooltips show up in the same line and clearly show these two stacked on top of each other. So I could go ahead and I could even add seconds of time spent as well, right? But this is where this is going to end for now. If you're more interested in all the options that go on with this, we'll be putting out videos in the future. All right, let's get to our last graph type that we're going to go over in this video, which is going to be pie graphs. So let me go ahead and add a new graph, click on here, and go ahead and select simple pie chart. All right, so you'll notice the prompt is a little bit different for this one. I'm just going to show you what this does so we can get a great idea of what's going on here with the pie graphs. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take activity, and I want this to be the labels that I see on my pie chart. However, each piece of the pie, I want to be the size that is corresponding to the amount of time I spent on that activity. I'll go ahead and grab time over here. And now for each record that I put into my form, I have the time showing up with the activity as the label. And it shows me what piece of the pie each one of those is. Now, just like in our last graph, we can go ahead and aggregate. We can do an average. So it'll show us the average amount of time we spend on each activity as a percent of our total time that we spend. You'll notice work is more than half. Now, we could also go ahead and add more slice values, but what's more interesting is what happens if I get rid of slice labels. Let me go ahead and do that. You'll notice 100% of the time we spent on our time stuff. So when we put time into each one of our records, it's 100% of the pie that we make up so far. If I go ahead and put minutes of time spent in here, however, now we have two pieces of the pie, one for time and one for the number of minutes spent, and we're currently averaging that out. So every record I put in, the average time that I put in was about 2.9, and that's 1.6% of this whole pie. And then the minutes spent is understandably 60 times larger. So that's the really cool thing about RLD is depending on what you want to do, we kind of analyze it and our engine comes up with the perfect display for exactly the options that you've put in. So this is all of the basics of the RLD graph infrastructure. Feel free to play around with them and find what works best for you. In our next video, we're going to be covering putting tables and graphs together inside of dashboards.